The flood of cheap, when low prices reshape the West. Walk into a store in New York, Berlin, Paris. Shelves are full, prices are lower, discounts are aggressive. It feels like progress. But drive 30 minutes outside the city, closed factories, empty warehouses, main streets that used to breathe steel, textiles, electronics now quiet. Here's the uncomfortable question: when prices fall, who actually pays the difference? The massive flow of manufactured goods from China into the US and EU markets is not a new story. Since China joined the WTO in 2001, global trade volumes exploded. Supply chains reorganized around Chinese manufacturing capacity. Consumers gained access to cheaper electronics, clothing, furniture, tools, and everyday goods. But economies are not built on checkout receipts alone. They are built on production, wages, innovation, and stability. And this is where the story gets complicated. First, the China shock, deindustrialization in real numbers. Economists Order, Dawn, and Hansen documented what became known as the China shock. Their research showed increased import competition from China led to substantial manufacturing job losses in the US between 1999 and 2011. Estimates suggest over 2 million US jobs were displaced due to Chinese import competition in that period. This wasn't evenly distributed. The damage concentrated in the American Rust Belt, textile regions in the Carolinas, furniture manufacturing in North Carolina, steel communities in Ohio and Pennsylvania. In Europe, similar patterns emerged in parts of northern Italy, Spain, France, eastern Germany. Manufacturing output did not disappear globally, it shifted. Production moved where labor costs were lower, regulations lighter, and scale unmatched. The result? Some regions hollowed out. You don't see this in GDP headlines. You see it in unemployment lines. Second, wage pressure and the erosion of bargaining power. When companies know they can outsource production to lower-cost regions, labor bargaining power weakens domestically. Even if a factory doesn't close, the threat of relocation suppresses wage growth. Between 2000 and 2015, many manufacturing-heavy US counties experienced slower wage growth, declining labor force participation, higher disability claims, reduced community investment. In parts of Europe, similar wage stagnation occurred in lower-skilled industrial sectors. Meanwhile, corporate profits often improved due to lower input costs. This dynamic contributed to rising inequality, political polarization, distrust in global institutions. Cheap imports are not inherently bad, but when wage growth stalls while productivity gains shift overseas, middle-class stability erodes. Third, supply chain dependency, a strategic risk exposed. The COVID-19 pandemic was a wake-up call. When factories shut down in China during early 2020, supply chains across the US and Europe froze. Critical shortages emerged in medical masks, protective equipment, pharmaceutical ingredients, electronics components, semiconductor chips. Dependence on concentrated production hubs created vulnerability. Modern economies rely on just-in-time logistics, efficient but fragile. When geopolitical tensions rise between the United States and China, trade becomes a political instrument. Tariffs, export controls, technology restrictions, economic interdependence becomes strategic leverage, and that changes how governments think about trade. Fourth, the struggle of local SMEs and domestic brands. Small and medium enterprises in Western economies operate under different cost structures, higher wages, environmental compliance costs, labor protections, safety regulations. Chinese manufacturers often benefit from massive economies of scale, industrial clustering, state-backed financing, infrastructure efficiency. This asymmetry means many small domestic manufacturers struggle to compete on price alone. Over time, local production shrinks, entrepreneurial ecosystems weaken, industrial knowledge dissipates. Innovation is not just about startups in tech hubs. It also depends on physical production capacity. Once that disappears, rebuilding it is expensive and slow. Fifth, environmental and ethical concerns. Another dimension often overlooked in price comparisons, environmental cost. China remains heavily reliant on coal for industrial energy. Manufacturing emissions tied to exported goods contribute significantly to global carbon output. When Western countries import goods instead of producing them domestically, emissions don't vanish, they shift geographically. The European Union has responded with mechanisms like carbon border adjustments to address this imbalance. The principle is simple: if a product's production generates high emissions, its environmental cost should not be externalized. Similarly, concerns around labor standards and supply chain transparency raise ethical questions. Consumers enjoy low prices, but rarely see the full production footprint. Sixth, political fallout and social instability. Economic dislocation fuels political reaction. In regions hit hardest by import competition, researchers observed higher support for populist candidates, increased anti-globalization sentiment, declining trust in institutions. The US-China trade war between 2018 and 2020 marked a turning point. Tariffs were imposed on hundreds of billions of dollars in goods, but data showed that a significant portion of tariff costs was passed on to American consumers and businesses. Trade barriers did not fully restore manufacturing jobs. Instead, they added complexity and cost to global supply chains. Protectionism is not a magic solution, but neither is unrestricted dependency. Seventh, the consumer paradox. Here's the hard truth: Chinese imports helped suppress inflation for decades. Lower-cost goods, increased purchasing power, made technology accessible, reduced cost of living for lower-income households. Without Chinese manufacturing scale, many everyday items could cost 20–40 more. So the narrative is not simple. Consumers benefit in the short term. Workers in certain sectors bear long-term adjustment costs. This creates a paradox. Cheap goods stabilize prices, but structural shifts destabilize communities. Eighth, is this unfair trade or just competitive advantage? Some critics argue that China's industrial rise is supported by state subsidies, strategic currency management, industrial policy targeting key sectors, export incentives. Supporters counter that China invested heavily in infrastructure, built manufacturing clusters, developed logistics efficiency, scaled production intelligently. The truth lies somewhere in between. Global trade has never been a purely free market phenomenon. Industrial policy exists everywhere, including in the US and Europe. The question is not whether countries support industry, it's whether the global system remains balanced and sustainable. Ninth, long-term structural risks. If Western economies become primarily consumption-driven while production concentrates elsewhere, several risks emerge: technological dependency, supply vulnerability, skills erosion in manufacturing, strategic weakness in critical sectors. Manufacturing is not only about jobs, it's about research ecosystems, engineering capacity, industrial innovation. Countries that lose production capacity may also lose applied innovation strength over time. 10th, realistic solutions beyond political slogans. Shutting down trade is unrealistic, but doing nothing is irresponsible. Here are pragmatic approaches. First, diversified supply chains. Rather than over-relying on a single country, businesses and governments can pursue a China Plus One strategy: Vietnam, India, Mexico, Eastern Europe. Diversification reduces concentration risk without dismantling global trade. Second, strategic reshoring. Not every industry should return, but critical sectors should. The US Chips and Science Act incentivizes domestic semiconductor manufacturing. The European Chips Act aims for similar goals. Strategic autonomy in key technologies is increasingly viewed as national security policy. Third, automation and advanced manufacturing. Competing with low wages is unrealistic. Competing with high productivity is viable. Investment in robotics, AI-driven manufacturing, additive manufacturing, smart factories can offset labor cost disadvantages. Advanced manufacturing allows high-wage economies to remain competitive. Fourth, smart trade policy. Selective tariffs targeting proven dumping practices. Carbon border adjustments to equalize environmental costs. Stronger anti-subsidy investigations when justified. The goal should be balance, not isolation. Fifth, SME support and industrial ecosystems. Small manufacturers need easier access to capital, tax incentives for innovation, export assistance, digital transformation support. Industrial clusters strengthen resilience. Once lost, rebuilding takes decades. Sixth, transparent consumer information. If consumers understand environmental footprint, supply chain origin, labor standards, they can make more informed decisions. Price is not the only metric. Sustainability and resilience matter too. The bigger picture, Globalization 2.0. We are entering a new phase. The era of hyper-globalization, where cost efficiency dominated all decisions, is giving way to strategic globalization. Resilience, security, sustainability, these are now as important as price. China will remain a major manufacturing power. The United States and Europe will not revert to 1980s industrial structures. But recalibration is underway. The real question is not whether Chinese products should stop flowing. The real question is, can global trade evolve into a system that balances efficiency with stability? If price remains the only priority, long-term structural weaknesses may deepen. If resilience becomes part of the equation, global trade can mature rather than fracture. Cheap feels good today, but economic durability determines tomorrow. And in a world shaped by geopolitical rivalry, technological competition, and climate pressure, durability matters more than ever.